Ladies and gentlemen, picture this a dusty frontier town, where tempers are hotter than the noonday sun, where men gather in a rush, fists clenched, voices raised, ready to deliver justice before the truth has even caught up. It's chaotic, it's reckless. And yet, when seen through the eyes of humor, it becomes a stage where human pride, folly, and courage collide in the most unforgettable way. Humor has always had a special place in human storytelling, but when it is applied to a genre like the Western, it creates a unique flavor that both entertains and teaches. In tales set in the Old West, readers usually expect gunfights, dusty saloons, tough cowboys, and justice delivered at the end of a smoking barrel. Yet, when humor is woven into this familiar landscape, it changes everything. The tone shifts from the harshness of survival and conflict to a kind of playful exaggeration where flaws, mistakes, and quirks of human nature are magnified. This is exactly what happens in the humorous Western style. Instead of focusing only on grit and blood, the story leans into absurdity, showing that even in the roughest environments, laughter and silliness find their way. The idea of a lynch mob, which in reality is a dark and serious subject, becomes a stage for comic misunderstandings, overreactions, and larger-than-life behavior. By presenting such grim elements through a lens of humor, the story makes readers reflect on how people act when they're swept up in emotion, all while keeping the mood light enough to laugh at the spectacle. The humorous Western tone often thrives on exaggeration, where characters are not just tough, but impossibly tough. Not just stubborn, but mule-headed to the point of comedy. Every fistfight, every argument, and every attempt at justice becomes so magnified that it feels both ridiculous and strangely believable. This exaggeration works as a mirror to society's tendency to dramatize everyday life. In a humorous Western, a misunderstanding over something small could escalate into a massive brawl, with chairs flying and walls crashing, not because it makes sense, but because people in their pride and quick tempers often allow the smallest sparks to start the biggest fires. Laughter comes naturally, because the reader sees truth hidden in the overblown actions, the same way we sometimes laugh at ourselves when we realize how foolish we've been in moments of heat. This tone balances action and comedy, so that while the story is filled with chaos, it never feels heavy. It becomes a joyful ride through the Wild West. Another element that defines this humorous tone is the use of dialect and colorful language. The way characters talk is as exaggerated as their actions, filled with slang, blunt honesty, and folksy turns of phrase that paint them as both rustic and strangely wise. Their words become part of the comedy, especially when they misinterpret each other or declare something outrageous with absolute confidence. The Western setting amplifies this effect, since these are people who pride themselves on toughness, independence, and common sense, yet often end up tangled in situations that prove they have anything but. It is through their speech that readers feel the rhythm of comedy, where every boast, insult, or offhand remark pushes the humor forward. This light-hearted tone doesn't just make readers laugh. It builds a world where seriousness can't take over for long, because there's always a ridiculous turn waiting around the corner. Underlying this comic atmosphere is a deep understanding of human behavior. The humorous Western tone doesn't mock the characters cruelly, but instead reveals their humanity by highlighting their flaws in a funny way. It suggests that even the strongest cowboy or the most determined lawman is still subject to pride, misunderstanding, and rash judgment. a mob might gather with the intention of delivering swift justice, but through the lens of humor. What the audience sees is not courage or wisdom, but the chaos of people tripping over their own assumptions. The comedy does not remove the seriousness of the themes. Instead, it shows them from a sideways angle, where laughter makes the lessons easier to digest. It is easier to think about the dangers of mob justice or human impulsiveness when the story lets you laugh first, because humor lowers defenses and invites reflection without demanding it. The humorous Western tone also captures the spirit of tall tales, where stories are not meant to be taken as literal truth, but as entertainment that contains a sliver of wisdom. These tales are filled with outlandish situations that border on the impossible, yet they feel right at home in the Western world, where the vast frontier itself inspired imaginations to stretch as wide as the horizon. A cowboy might wrestle 10 men at once, a brawl might destroy an entire saloon, or a lynch mob might turn into a comedy of errors where nobody remembers what they were angry about in the first place. These exaggerations make the story larger than life, and yet they always circle back to a recognizable truth about human nature. By mixing humor with the Western setting, the tone not only entertains, but also honors the storytelling tradition of the frontier, where laughter was as much a survival tool as grit or gunpowder. Pike Bearfield stands as one of those characters who could only belong to the Western world, yet, at the same time, feels so exaggerated and colorful that he almost steps outside of it. He is not the polished hero of dime novels, nor is he the hardened outlaw without conscience. Instead, he is the type of man who charges into situations with a blend of strength, stubbornness, and comic blundering that makes him larger than life. The essence of Pike is built around contradiction. He is both fierce and clumsy, brave and reckless, loyal yet often misguided. When readers encounter him, they do not see a flawless frontier knight, but a man who embodies the wild chaos of the Old West in a way that makes them laugh even while admiring his resilience. Pike is rugged, not just in appearance but in spirit, the kind of character who acts first and thinks later, if he ever bothers to think at all. His stories are filled with fights, arguments, and impossible scrapes, yet somehow he stumbles out of them not only alive, but often triumphant in the most unexpected ways. What makes Pike particularly compelling is his sheer physicality, exaggerated to almost mythic levels. He is portrayed as immensely strong, the kind of man who can throw punches that send others flying or wrestle opponents into the dust without breaking much of a sweat. This superhuman toughness is one of the cornerstones of his comedy. No matter how many times he is knocked down, tied up, or cornered, Pike manages to break free through brute force and wild determination. Readers laugh not because his strength is believable, but because it is so over the top that it turns serious brawls into slapstick spectacles. Yet this exaggerated power also reflects something deeper about his character, a refusal to quit, an instinct to keep fighting no matter how ridiculous the odds. In a world where survival often depended on sheer stubbornness, Pike's strength becomes both a weapon and a joke, a quality that makes him endlessly entertaining. Another aspect that defines Pike is his simple, almost childlike view of the world. He is not cunning or strategic, and he rarely plans his actions carefully. Instead, he reacts instinctively, often driven by pride, loyalty, or a sense of rough justice that doesn't always line up with reason. This simplicity makes him a constant source of comedy, because he frequently misunderstands situations, misjudges people's intentions, or takes offense at the wrong moment. The audience sees the gap between Pike's perception and reality, and it is in that gap where the humor flourishes. His innocence in certain matters makes him endearing, even when his temper leads him to swing fists before asking questions. In a way, he embodies the Western spirit of directness and honesty, even if it gets him tangled in trouble more often than not. Readers laugh at his blunders, but also recognize a kernel of truth in his straightforward approach to life. What keeps Pike from being a flat caricature is the warmth behind his bluster. For all his roughness and quick temper, he often shows a big, hearted side, whether it is loyalty to a friend, outrage at injustice, or a protective instinct for those weaker than himself. This hidden tenderness makes his exaggerated behavior more human. Because beneath the comedy of his fights and overreactions lies a man who genuinely cares, even if he cannot always express it in graceful ways. His flaws do not erase his good qualities, rather, they make him more relatable. Readers can laugh at his foolishness one moment and admire his courage the next. He becomes a reflection of human imperfection, magnified through the lens of Western exaggeration. The way Pike interacts with the world around him also adds to the humor of his character. He is constantly butting heads with others, whether it is through misunderstandings, challenges to his pride, or sheer coincidence. These clashes often spiral into comic chaos, where entire towns or groups of men are drawn into the whirlwind of his actions. Pike rarely sets out to cause mayhem. Yet somehow mayhem follows him like a shadow. The audience enjoys watching this cycle repeat, because it never fails to deliver laughter, along with the satisfaction of seeing Pike come out on top, often in ways that make no logical sense. His adventures feel like tall tales, designed to make readers grin while marveling at the absurdity of what he endures and overcomes. Pike Bearfield's character thrives in this exaggerated environment because he is not meant to be taken too seriously. He is a parody of Western heroism, a man who embodies the toughness of the frontier, but in such an outsized, chaotic way that he becomes a living joke, as well as a symbol of resilience. His flaws are not hidden, but celebrated, turned into sources of humor that invite readers to see the Old West, not as a grim battlefield of survival, but as a place where even in the harshest conditions, humanity's clumsiness and good-hearted foolishness shine through. Pike represents the comic side of heroism, showing that strength and courage often go hand in hand with blunder and misunderstanding. Through him, the humorous Western finds its perfect vehicle, a character who makes readers laugh while reminding them that imperfection is part of what makes people not only entertaining, but deeply human. Frontier justice has always been a complicated theme in Western stories, and when humor is tied to it, the results can be both insightful and entertaining. In the world of the Old West, where laws were thin and formal courts were often miles away, people created their own systems of order, sometimes relying on the quick decision of a sheriff, but often resorting to mob justice. The Lynch mob, in particular, became a symbol of this kind of impulsive order, where a group of men, fueled by anger, pride, or suspicion, would gather to deliver what they believed to be justice. The serious reality behind this is grim, but in a humorous Western like Gents on the Lynch, it becomes a stage for comedy. The exaggerated actions of townsfolk, the misunderstandings that spark chaos, and the reckless eagerness of men to act before thinking all combine to create a scenario where the flaws of human behavior are exposed. Readers laugh not at the violence, but at the way people turn into caricatures of themselves when swept up in collective emotion. The key to understanding the humor of frontier justice lies in its the top nature. Men who might otherwise be reasonable suddenly become fierce champions of law and order, ready to hang someone at the drop of a hat, even when they barely understand the facts. Their rush to act is funny, because it highlights the absurdity of human impatience. The mob doesn't stop to think about fairness or evidence. They are more concerned with showing strength, proving toughness, and satisfying their emotions. In the story, this rush to judgment creates countless opportunities for comic mishaps. One man might shout out accusations, another might misinterpret them, and before long the entire crowd is in an uproar, convinced that their actions are righteous even though they barely know what they're fighting for. This ridiculous spiral mirrors real life tendencies of people to exaggerate situations, and it is through laughter that readers recognize the truth of it. Another layer of humor in frontier justice comes from the clashing personalities within the mob itself. In a Western town, everyone has a sense of pride and reputation to uphold, and when a group comes together to act as judge, jury, and executioner, those personalities clash in spectacular ways. One man might want to take charge, another might challenge him, and soon the supposed pursuit of justice turns into a chaotic struggle for dominance. The comedy arises from watching grown men who pride themselves on being rugged and rational descend into petty arguments and physical brawls while claiming to serve a higher cause. Their seriousness only makes the humor stronger, because the audience can see that their authority is built on nothing more than bluster and ego. It is a satirical take on leadership and mob mentality, showing how quickly order can dissolve into absurdity when too many loud voices try to steer the same course. The humor also rests in the gap between appearance and reality. A Lynch mob might look intimidating from the outside, a fearsome force of angry men united for a single purpose. Yet once the story pulls the audience inside that mob, the cracks begin to show. Half the men don't know exactly why they are there. Others are motivated by grudges or personal gain, and still others simply follow along because they don't want to be left out. The supposed unity of purpose is revealed as a messy collection of selfish motives and misunderstandings. This disconnection creates endless opportunities for comic twists. For example, someone might suddenly realize they are chasing the wrong man, or the supposed criminal might turn out to be completely innocent, forcing the mob to stumble awkwardly through its mistake. The laughter comes not just from the ridiculousness of the scene, but from the recognition that human beings often act in groups without truly knowing why. The satire of frontier justice in a humorous Western is sharp because it exposes the dangers of rash action while still keeping the tone light. Instead of condemning the mob with heavy seriousness, the story invites readers to laugh at its foolishness. The humor softens the critique, but does not erase it. By making the mob ridiculous, the story highlights the risks of letting emotion and pride drive decisions that should be handled with fairness and patience. It becomes clear that justice is not achieved through noise and numbers, but through careful thought, something that rarely happens in these comic tales. The exaggeration of the mob's behavior allows readers to reflect on these truths, without feeling burdened by the darker side of the subject. In the safety of humor, the critique lands more effectively because it bypasses defensiveness and appeals to common sense through laughter. At its core, the humor surrounding frontier justice reflects the larger theme of human impulsiveness. Whether in a dusty Western town or in modern life, people often rush to judgment, fueled by pride, fear, or the desire to belong to a group. The lynch mob becomes a perfect symbol of this tendency, and by presenting it in exaggerated, comic form, the story transforms a grim reality into a lesson carried by laughter. The mob's overreactions, the misunderstandings that fuel its actions, and the chaos that follows all demonstrate that justice pursued without reason quickly dissolves into nonsense. By the end, the reader is left with the recognition that while the mob sees itself as the hand of justice, it is far more often the source of comedy. Exaggeration and tall tale style are the lifeblood of humorous Western storytelling, and in a story like Gents on the Lynch, they take center stage in shaping both character and plot. The tall tale tradition reaches back to the frontier itself, where men around campfires would spin yarns that grew taller with every telling. These stories were not meant to be taken literally. They were meant to impress, amuse, and create a sense of wonder. In the Western setting, this style becomes a natural fit because the land itself feels larger than life. Endless plains, towering mountains, and dangers at every turn. To match that landscape, the characters and their actions are stretched beyond the limits of reality until they become almost mythic. A fight isn't just a scuffle between two men, it is a wild brawl that shakes the whole town. A cowboy isn't just strong. He's strong enough to send a man flying through a wall with a single punch. The tall tale thrives on such exaggerations, and readers delight in the absurdity because it entertains while also reflecting truths about courage, foolishness, and pride. One of the key ways exaggeration works in these stories is by magnifying ordinary events until they become spectacles. Something as simple as a quarrel over a card game might spiral into a free for all that destroys a saloon, leaving splintered furniture, broken glass, and unconscious bodies strewn across the floor. The comedy lies not in the violence itself, but in the sheer scale of it. Each action escalates beyond reason, and yet the characters act as though it is all perfectly natural. The humor arises from the contrast between the outrageousness of the events and the straight-faced way the characters respond to them. This kind of exaggeration creates a rhythm in the storytelling, where readers anticipate not just what will happen, but how ridiculously it will unfold. Tall tale style also thrives in the descriptions of characters, especially larger than life figures like Pike Bearfield. His strength, stubbornness, and blundering heroics are all painted in such exaggerated strokes that he becomes almost a caricature of the Western frontiersman. He can take on impossible odds, survive disasters that would kill ordinary men, and turn chaos into victory, often without even realizing how. These qualities are exaggerated for comic effect, but they also embody the spirit of the frontier: resilient, reckless, and bold. Readers laugh at Pike's impossible feats, yet at the same time they admire the qualities he represents. The tall tale exaggerates not just to entertain, but also to highlight virtues and flaws in ways that feel both comic and symbolic. Another important aspect of exaggeration in this style is the way it exposes human behavior. By stretching events to the point of absurdity, the story reveals how pride, fear, or stubbornness can drive people into ridiculous situations. A lynch mob, for example, is already a rash and dangerous gathering, but in the tall tale style it becomes an even bigger farce. Men shouting over one another, stumbling into fights, or chasing the wrong person entirely. The humor comes from recognizing how small human flaws, when magnified, lead to chaos that is both funny and revealing. Exaggeration, in this sense, is not just decoration. It is a tool for showing truth through laughter. By making people bigger, louder, and more foolish than they really are, the story holds up a mirror that reflects reality in a distorted but recognizable way. The tall tale tradition also allows for a sense of wonder that keeps the story lively. The audience knows the events are impossible, but they suspend disbelief because the exaggeration is so entertaining. This suspension creates a playful contract between storyteller and listener. Both understand the impossibility, but both enjoy the ride. In Gents on the Lynch, the humor comes from watching events spiral out of control in ways that no one could predict, yet which feel perfectly fitting in the exaggerated world of the tale. The laughter comes not just from the scale of the events, but from the delight of being swept up in a story that refuses to be limited by ordinary reality. Exaggeration also enhances the pacing of the story. In a realistic Western, tension might build slowly, leading to a dramatic confrontation. In a humorous tall tale, the build-up is quick, and the escalation happens almost instantly. One insult leads to a brawl, one accusation leads to a mob, and within moments the scene is out of control. This rapid escalation keeps the energy high, drawing the reader deeper into the chaos. The absurdity of how fast things unravel becomes part of the comedy, and the reader enjoys the sense that anything could happen next. The tall tale style thrives on unpredictability, and exaggeration ensures that the surprises are always outrageous enough to amuse. What makes this style so enduring is that it does more than entertain. Beneath the exaggeration lies a subtle commentary on human nature. By turning small conflicts into enormous spectacles, the story shows how easily people let pride or temper get the better of them. By painting characters as impossibly strong or foolish, it highlights the extremes of human behavior that exist in smaller, quieter ways in everyday life. The laughter that comes from exaggeration is not just about absurdity. It is about recognition. Readers laugh because they see truth stretched to the point of comedy, and that recognition makes the humor more meaningful. In this way, exaggeration and tall tale style turn the Western landscape into a playground of laughter, where chaos, folly, and resilience all come together in stories that are as entertaining as they are revealing. Satire of society lies at the heart of a humorous Western, and in Gents on the Lynch, it becomes one of the most effective tools for turning rough, frontier life into comedy. Satire works by exaggerating human flaws and social behavior to expose the foolishness hidden within them, and in the setting of the Old West, those flaws are ripe for exploration. The Western frontier was a place where order was fragile, justice was improvised, and reputation often meant more than truth. When these elements are exaggerated for comic effect, they reveal not only the silliness of mob mentality, but also the way pride and rashness can overshadow reason. The satire does not ridicule individuals in isolation. Instead, it points to broader patterns of behavior, showing how entire communities can lose their sense of perspective when caught up in passion, rivalry, or a need to prove themselves. The laughter comes not from cruelty, but from recognition. Recognition that people, no matter the time period, often act in ways that are as irrational as they are entertaining. One of the clearest targets of satire in the story is mob mentality. The Lynch mob forms as a reaction to perceived injustice, but instead of calmly considering the facts, the group rushes headlong into action. Men shout accusations without evidence, others join in simply because they don't want to seem weak. And soon the crowd is swept up in a storm of noise and confusion. The humor emerges as the mob turns into a parody of itself. Less a gathering of justice seekers and more a band of bumbling men who can't agree on what they're angry about. This satirical portrayal highlights how easily groups can abandon reason when carried away by collective emotion. Readers laugh because the exaggerated foolishness feels familiar, echoing moments in real life where groups act with more heat than light. The satire also pokes fun at the Western obsession with toughness and reputation. In frontier towns, men were constantly measuring themselves against one another, eager to prove who was braver, stronger, or more decisive. In the story, this cultural trait becomes a source of comedy, as men push themselves into the mob not out of conviction, but out of fear of looking weak. Each individual wants to appear as though he is the backbone of justice, yet their eagerness to display courage only adds to the chaos. The satire lies in the contradiction, men trying to look dignified and noble while behaving in ways that are childish and reckless. By exposing this contradiction, the story gently mocks the performative nature of masculinity in the Old West, showing how much of it was bluster wrapped in pride. Another satirical element comes from the way authority is portrayed. In theory, leaders within the mob should bring order and direction, but in practice, they only add to the confusion. Characters who try to take charge often end up arguing with each other, issuing conflicting commands, or losing control of the crowd altogether. This satire of authority reflects the broader truth that leadership without wisdom or patience is hollow. In the exaggerated world of the humorous Western, the supposed leaders look more like clowns than figures of respect, and the mob that follows them looks more like a carnival than a tribunal. The comedy highlights a serious idea. Without fairness and level-headedness, authority is nothing more than noise. Satire also works its way into the depiction of community life. The same people who gather for a lynching are the ones who gossip in the saloon, boast in the streets, and settle scores in public. The story uses humor to show how personal grudges and petty rivalries often sneak into supposedly noble causes. A man might support the mob not because he cares about justice but because he wants to settle an old debt or embarrass a rival. The satire here points to the way personal motives often corrupt collective action. By exposing these hidden agendas through comic exaggeration, the story shows how little true justice is present in such gatherings. Readers laugh at the silliness, but they also see the uncomfortable truth that people often cloak selfishness in the language of righteousness. What makes this satire so effective is that it avoids cruelty. The story does not condemn its characters with bitterness, but instead uses laughter to soften the critique. The exaggerated behavior makes the flaws obvious without stripping the characters of their humanity. They are foolish, yes, but their foolishness feels universal, rather than unique to them. Through satire, the story invites readers to see themselves in these moments of rashness, pride, and overreaction. The laughter it provokes is not distant or scornful, but familiar, as though reminding the audience that everyone, at some point, has acted in ways just as irrational, when swept up in emotion or group pressure. The brilliance of satirizing society in this way is that it entertains while it teaches. Readers enjoy the absurdity of the mob, the petty rivalries, and the exaggerated masculinity, but beneath the humor, they absorb a critique of human behavior that is timeless. The Old West becomes a stage for showing how pride, fear, and impulsiveness can distort justice. and the satire ensures that these lessons are delivered in a way that is engaging rather than heavy-handed. By blending laughter with insight, the story keeps its audience amused, while leaving them with a deeper understanding of the flaws that make people both ridiculous and real. Laughter has always been one of the most powerful tools for delivering lessons, and in a humorous Western story, like Gents on the Lynch, it becomes the bridge between entertainment and reflection. The Old West setting is full of raw themes: violence, survival, justice, pride, and these could easily weigh heavily on the reader if told with too much seriousness. But when humor is woven into the fabric of the story, those same themes are presented in a way that feels approachable and thought-provoking without being burdensome. The comic misunderstandings, the exaggerated brawls, the blundering of mobs, and the ridiculous overreactions of men all work together to create laughter first. Yet after the laughter fades, the reader is left thinking about what those moments reveal. In this way, humor becomes not just a source of amusement, but a gentle teacher, offering lessons about justice, patience, and wisdom without the need for lectures or moral preaching. The heart of this technique lies in showing that people often act foolishly when emotions take over. In Gents on the Lynch, the rush to mob justice is painted as chaotic and comic, with men shouting, stumbling, and making rash decisions that spiral out of control. Readers laugh at the spectacle, but at the same time, they can recognize the truth behind it. Human beings, in any time period, have a tendency to react impulsively, letting pride or anger dictate their choices, rather than reason. By exaggerating this tendency into absurdity, the story allows the audience to reflect on it without feeling attacked. The humor lowers defenses, turning criticism of rashness into something playful rather than accusatory. This is why the lesson lands more effectively, because it comes wrapped in comedy, not condemnation. Another important aspect of learning through laughter in this story is the way characters like Pike Bearfield embody both strength and foolishness. Pike is tough, loyal, and resilient, but he is also hot-headed and reckless. His wild misadventures make readers laugh, but they also show how rushing into action without thinking can create more trouble than it solves. In Pike's blunders, the audience sees a reflection of their own moments of impatience or pride, only blown up to a scale that is impossible not to laugh at. This balance of admiration and amusement makes the lesson palatable. Instead of feeling like they are being told not to make mistakes, readers are invited to laugh at mistakes so exaggerated that the wisdom emerges naturally. The laughter becomes a soft cushion for the truth beneath it. The use of humor to teach lessons also comes through in the way justice is portrayed. A lynch mob in real life is a dark and serious subject, but in the story it becomes a farcical display of confusion and bravado. The men believe they are upholding order, but their actions reveal the opposite disorder, selfish motives, and collective foolishness. The audience laughs at their antics, but in doing so, they also understand the danger of letting mobs or emotions decide justice. The comedy makes the point memorable because it is tied to absurd images and exaggerated behavior. Long after the laughter fades, the idea remains that fairness and patience are essential, and that rushing to judgment often leads to disaster. The lesson is not hammered in through solemnity, but slipped in through comedy, which makes it easier to accept and recall. Tall tale exaggeration strengthens this effect by pushing the humor beyond the ordinary. When a fight levels a saloon or a mob trips over its own plans, the absurdity makes the story larger than life. Yet, hidden within the exaggeration is a very real message about how people behave under pressure. The scale of the comedy may be impossible, but the core truth is not. By laughing at events that are ridiculous on the surface, the audience becomes more open to reflecting on the real tendencies that inspired them. Humor acts as a disguise for wisdom, drawing readers in with laughter, and then revealing insights they might not have been willing to face in a more serious telling. The effectiveness of lessons through laughter also lies in how universal the themes are. The frontier setting may feel distant, but the flaws being exaggerated. Impatience, pride, rashness, mob behavior are timeless. People today can recognize the same tendencies in modern groups, communities, and even within themselves. By laughing at the antics of a Western mob, they also gain perspective on how similar behaviors play out in their own lives. Humor makes the story timeless because it connects the past and present through shared human foolishness. The lesson becomes not only about the Old West, but about humanity in general, and laughter becomes the tool that makes that connection possible. Perhaps the most powerful part of teaching through humor is that it allows people to embrace imperfection. In a humorous Western, nobody is perfect. Heroes are flawed, mobs are foolish, and justice is often clumsy. Yet instead of despairing over this, the audience laughs and moves forward with a sense of understanding. The lesson is that mistakes are inevitable, that people will always stumble into foolishness, but that recognizing and learning from it is what matters. Laughter softens the sharp edges of these truths, making them easier to carry. The comedy entertains first, but the wisdom it carries lingers quietly, ready to be remembered when life presents its own moments of rashness or pride. Through this blend of humor and insight, the story transforms into more than just entertainment. It becomes a gentle reminder that wisdom often hides behind the mask of laughter. So, my friends, when we step back and look at this story, we see more than just a rowdy Western filled with mobs, brawls, and tall tale antics. We see a mirror of ourselves. The humor reminds us that people, no matter where or when, are quick to judge, quick to act, and quick to let pride run ahead of patience. Yet it also reminds us that beneath all the bluster, there is strength, loyalty, and the ability to laugh at our own mistakes. That is the true gift of a tale like Gents on the Lynch. It makes us smile while showing us that wisdom and justice are not found in noise, but in reflection, fairness, and humility. The West it portrays may be wild and exaggerated, but its lessons are timeless. Don't let the mob inside you control your choices. Don't let pride blind your judgment, and never underestimate the power of laughter to reveal truth.